We'll continue our pest management series with weed management, and with us is Dr. Joe Ikley.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to go through a couple of updates here over the next 20 minutes or so. The first update I need to give, though, is the number one weed control question of the extension season so far, and that's where's the weed guide and how do I get it? And so if you're near campus, AgCom's distribution center, you can go to the Morrill Hall basement and pick up some copies. Call that phone number on the screen. If you prefer electronic, I've got a QR code here, which brings you to the electronic version of the weed control guide. You could also just Google NDSU weed control guide, and it should be one of the top hits to get you there as well. And I'll put this QR code up again at the end of my talk. Just kind of wanted to say the different ways where we can get a hold of the guide, since we're not having too many of these meetings in person. So here's the three main topics I was going to cover this morning. So some additional information on using cover crops for weed control and dry bean. A little information on mare's tail or horseweed, because we're getting some more questions about that being a problem in dry beans in certain parts of the state. And then some more information on water hemp. It's becoming very problematic in many fields in Minnesota and is spreading north and west into some of our North Dakota dry bean fields as well. And I'll just kind of mention this now, but when I get into water hemp and talking about control measures for water hemp and dry bean, that's also going to work for our other pigweeds such as Powell amaranth and redroot pigweed, which we are having some increasing problems with as we get more ALS or group 2 resistance into those populations. So first of all, for the update on cover crop weed control, and this is all information that's coming out of the Carrington REC, and Greg Enders has led this a lot over the last 4 years, led this project, and going to share some of the data he has generated from this research project. So first, we're going to start with yield. So this will be a pinto bean yield with different rye termination treatments. And so the way this study was established was rye was planted in the fall, but then we did have a fall tillage to eliminate that rye. So basically a no rye check. And so what we're looking at here is treatment number 1, which is the black bar on the left, was that no rye treatment. And we had just glyphosate for a burn down plus a pre-emergence herbicide of Spartan Elite. And then that's the yield from that treatment. If you look at treatments 2, 3, and 4, these are all treatments where we use glyphosate to terminate the rye between 20 and 36 days before planting the pinto beans in 2020. So still had that rye there, terminated prior to planting. And all three of these treatments, the yields are pretty equivalent to the no rye check. It's treatments 5 and 6 where we lost yield in the 2020 experiment. And that was where we planted pinto beans green. So we planted into the living rye cover crop and then used glyphosate to terminate rye after planting. Treatment 5 was 1 day after planting, and then treatment 6 was glyphosate applied 10 days after planting. This is becoming a pretty popular approach to using rye within soybeans. And I know we're looking at this in dry beans because moisture is always a concern when we have this type of treatment. It's really a way to try and get the best weed control out of a rye cover crop. But of course, with dry beans, we're going to have the concern about using too much moisture by delaying the termination of this rye cover crop. And that's exactly what Greg saw there in 2020. When we delayed termination of that cover crop, we ended up losing yield. And that's mainly due to that rye using up all the moisture in the topsoil and going into a dry June. When it comes to the actual weed control benefits of these treatments, so again, the same 6 treatments here on the x-axis. The yellow bar is foxtails or pigeon grass, and the gray bar will be common lamb's quarters. And I'm going to point out the treatments that worked best. And so if we look at, first we'll start with the no rye check, where we just use glyphosate and then Spartan Elite as a pre-emergence herbicide, between 85 and 95% control of those species. What also worked pretty well was having that rye cover crop, terminating it about 5 weeks prior to planting, and then also using that pre-emergence herbicide at planting. Then the other 2 treatments that performed quite well as far as weed control is concerned was when we just used glyphosate and no pre-emergence herbicide, but use that glyphosate after planting to terminate rye. So in this case, we saw the benefit of allowing that rye to grow and got some weed suppression benefit out of this. But if you remember going back to the yields, we did lose yield because of using up some of that moisture. So in this case, we can see a weed control benefit, but it becomes a bit of a balancing act. And so really, if we were going to have rye into our system and want to plant pinto beans or other dry beans afterwards, that's where something like treatment 3 is looking like one of our promising treatments. Terminate that rye cover crop early and then still use a pre-emergence herbicide to get our weed control benefit out of that pre as well. Now those two slides were the 2020 data. So here's the compilation of 3 site years of data. So from 2018 through 2020. And now we've consolidated these charts a little bit. So we have 4 bars. And on the left now we've got that conventional check. So no rye where we use a pre-emergence herbicide. And this is just on foxtail control. So over 3 years, no rye, just a pre-emergence herbicide. 1 month after planting, we've had about 80% control on foxtail. When we compare that to terminating a rye cover crop about 5 weeks before planting and then also using that pre-emergence herbicide, pretty equivalent control. Where we just terminate the rye early and don't have a pre-emergence herbicide, that's when we start to lose some actual weed control on foxtail over these 3 years. And actually, as far as numerically, the best control we saw was applying glyphosate near planting of the dry beans. So again, did not have a residual herbicide on here, just looking at the weed control ability of rye, allowing it to go pretty late and then terminating that with glyphosate. In that case, over 3 years, about 86% control of the foxtail species. But again, we want to take a look at the yield with these type of treatments as well. And now that over that same 3-year period where we had pretty good foxtail control without the residual herbicide and just using glyphosate near planting, that's where we did see the lowest yield. So again, there in Carrington, a number of dry years in a row, and we're seeing the weed control benefit of allowing that rye to get pretty big, but we're also seeing some moisture loss that interferes with stand establishment and it ultimately affects the yield of our dry beans. Comparing that to some of our other programs here, either conventional check or where we terminate that rye early, we can still get some pretty good yields, pretty comparable to a no rye check. So bottom line here is over a number of years, it's really kind of a balancing act, and that's what Greg summarized here in this slide, is that yes, we are seeing some benefit of weed control or weed suppression, but we do need to kind of balance that against using up too much moisture and allowing that rye to grow too late into the spring and early parts of the summer. So some general conclusions here that we can use rye as a supplement to a soil applied herbicide. Again, if we go back to some of those data slides, it's where we terminated the rye early and had that pre-emergence herbicide on, where we were able to maintain yields and get some pretty good weed control while working rye into a system. Now, the weeds that Greg had evaluated were, as I mentioned, common lamb's quarters, foxtails. There's a year or so of kochia data that I'm not presenting here. So we know that rye can be a pretty good weed control tool for some of our weeds, but there are some weed species that are just inherently tolerant to rye as a cover crop. So they're able to grow quite well with rye out there. And these tend to be our legumes and our mint species, such as lanceleaf sage. All right, switching gears now to talk a little bit about mare's tail or horseweed. So again, this weed is continuing to become more problematic across the acres in our state. And when I talk about horseweed or mare's tail, I do always like to talk a little bit about the biology, because this is one of the reasons it can become problematic. And so I'm really going to focus on the second bullet point here. When we talk about this weed, we typically say it's a winter annual weed. Germinates in the fall in the August to September timeframe, overwinters, and then starts bolting in the spring. However, we do know that this can act as a summer annual weed. We do have a certain percentage of the population that's not going to germinate until sometime in May, June, maybe even July. And in this case, in the winter annual, it overwinters as a rosette and starts bolting. The summer annual biotype does not enter a rosette phase. It will start bolting immediately. So it's the flexibility that this weed has to germinate across different parts of the year and then become competitive relatively quickly when it acts as a summer annual, that can make it challenging. And oftentimes we have a certain mix of both biotypes in the same field, and that's where it can become even challenging as a systems approach when we're trying to control this weed. So just want to show that a little bit here in picture form. Here in the top left, this is some spring emerging mare's tail, and you'll see a bunch of these little small plants. There's immediately bolting, no rosette phase. And just for size, this is mixed in with some water hemp. So mare's tail probably germinated about a week or two before this water hemp in this particular picture. Where it can be problematic is when we have it in the fall and overwinters, and then we'll have a range of mare's tail in the spring when we go to plant that might look something like this picture in the bottom right. So plants that may be 6 to 8 inches tall mixed in with plants that are just starting to bolt at 2 to 3 inches tall. And there's probably going to be some spring emergence in here as well. And so this is why mare's tail can be very problematic and difficult to control in the spring, because we've had plants that have overwintered. We're going to have a range of sizes to deal with when we try and use a burn down application. And we also may have some spring emergence in there as well. So what I've basically been doing is I've tried to compile everything we can think about for mare's tail management into one slide, and this is across basically all the crops that we have. And I show this slide because I'm going to show some options in dry bean on the next slide, and a lot of these options are going to go away, which is why when we have some of these fields that we have some mare's tail and plant dry beans in it, we can have a real challenge trying to control these weeds. So if we talk about three main principles, we need to have our field free of mare's tail at the time of planting. A number of ways to get this done if we're working with the winter annual biotype, which is primarily what we have across the state. That's when we can go after it with a fall burn down application, and it can be a pretty cheap program, something like a pint of 2,4-D, and then throw in some glyphosate to pick up some of your other winter annual weeds as well. Burn down control becomes tougher in the spring. There's a couple of good options in front of some of our other crops, but some of these products listed here, we cannot use in front of dry beans. So it really is going to be more problematic in a no-till situation to have good burn down control of mare's tail ahead of dry beans. The other thing we need to do is, because we have some spring residual or some spring emerging populations, we need a good residual herbicide program to get us some control well into the season. And again, some of the best products we have for this aren't available in dry bean. And then ultimately, because of glyphosate and group 2 or ALS resistance, it becomes pretty problematic to clean up post-emergence in crop and several of our crops that we'll deal with, dry beans being one of those. So again, here's some of the things we can do across all of our crops. When we look at dry bean, that's where it just becomes more difficult. So again, fall burn down, we're really locked into something like 2,4-D because of rotation restrictions with dicamba. Burn down, we really only have paraquat that we can use if we have glyphosate resistance for a good burn down program. If we're using tillage, we do need to make sure we have aggressive tillage. Something like vertical tillage or even one quick pass with a field cultivator may not be enough to uproot and dislodge some of those fall emerging populations. And then again, because we have spring emergence, we need a residual product. Unfortunately, with dry beans, the only good thing we have is Spartan. So Spartan Charge or Spartan Elite. So the highest rate you're comfortable with on your soil type, that's what we need to do for residual activity on mare's tail in dry beans. And then post-emergence control is very difficult. So really, once mare's tail gets over 2 inches, we don't really have much of a shot at all in dry beans of controlling the plants that are out there. I know Brian Jenks has some data where if you use 2 pints of Bazagran and that mare's tail is small, less than 2 inches, then we were able to get some suppression out of that. I believe 80% suppression or control is what he was looking at with that treatment. And that's really all we have post-emergence for mare's tail and dry beans. So, and that's why it can become pretty problematic. That's why I bolded at the top here. We just need to make sure there's no green or living plants of mare's tail when we plant. Okay, just going to shift gears here to water hemp. Just a couple slides to keep us on time. So again, principles here apply to something like pal amaranth as well. But the main thing we need to remember when we have a tough weed like water hemp within a broadleaf crop is that it's got a long emergence period water hemp does. So water hemp can emerge from basically May throughout the entire growing season as long as we don't have a crop canopy. And so if we look at a typical program with a pre-emergence herbicide and then no more residual activity out of our post herbicides, we'll have a window here where there's no herbicide in the soil to control the water hemp that's trying to emerge and no crop canopy to suppress germination of late emerging water hemp. And this is where we need to add another residual herbicide sometime early in the vegetative growth stages to get us more residual in that soil to control these June and July emerging water hemp populations. And so again, this type of control option, we have more options in the crop like soybean. Dry bean becomes very limited just because of the number of herbicides that we have. And so if we're going after specifically water hemp, and again, the other pigweeds as well, a product like Spartan Elite is one of the products we can start with that's pretty good residual activity on the pigweed species. We can also use Outlook pre-emergence, and then anything yellow that we can incorporate is also pretty good treatments on these pigweeds. Again, we're pretty limited post-emergence. So as far as foliar activity on water hemp, because it is going to be ALS or group 2 resistant, we basically have Reflex available in dry beans for foliar activity. We can use Outlook in the early vegetative growth stages to get some additional residual activity. And that's really it as far as programs when we have, whether it's water hemp or if we have group 2 resistant Powell amaranth or redroot pigweed. So real quickly, 2 more slides. I want to show some data from my colleague in Western Nebraska. So he deals a lot with Palmer amaranth in his dry beans out there in Western Nebraska. And he's got a couple years of data showing some of these programs we can use in dry beans to clean up Palmer amaranth. And when it comes to chemical control of the pigweeds, anything that works for Palmer works for water hemp. And then anything that works for Palmer and water hemp will also work for our other pigweeds that we deal with. So I wanted to show here some of his results is when we look at pre-emergence herbicides, and he doesn't use Spartan Elite here just because of his soil types, but what he's basically seen consistently is that a combination of Eptam and Sonlan incorporated tend to give a little bit longer length of residual than a premix of or a tank mix of Prowl and Outlook. And this is shown in picture form up here. Here's Prowl and Outlook on the left, and then Eptam and Sonlan on the right. So again, in a soil type where he can't use Spartan, if he incorporates Eptam and Sonlan, that's been his most consistent treatment pre-emergence for Palmer. Then as far as this layered residual activity, he's looked at a couple of different programs. And basically what we're going to look at here on ALS-resistant Palmer, which would be similar to water hemp, the Raptor and Bazagran in this tank mix aren't providing much foliar activity. He's really relying on Reflex for any foliar activity. What he's really trying to do here is get the timing of that layered residual right. So he's basically looking at adding more Outlook at V1, so first trifoliate, or V3, 3 trifoliates. 2019, that first trifoliate gave him 95% control at the end of the season, only 64% at V3. So basically, enough Palmer was up here that V3 was too late to apply that Outlook and get the benefit of the layered residual. 2020, he had similar results depending on when he applied at V1 or V3. And again, that's likely due to the fact that he did not have Palmer emerge between V1 and V3. So V3 in this case in 2020 was still early enough for him. So it's going to depend on when we can get that residual on to get more activity. But in general, this V1 growth stage looks pretty promising for Palmer down there. And I'll be looking at this here on water hemp in 2021. But I suspect we'll see some pretty similar results up here. So I want to make sure we're still on time. So that's what I was going to end with. Here's contact information if you had follow-up questions, if we don't have time for such. Office phone number there. Email address. If you're on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle. And then again, the QR code for the weed guide.